Welcome to the Scythe Mugen 5. Hello there, EV here. Today we're checking out the Scythe Mugen 5, a 155mm tall cooler up for contention in our 160mm category in our cooler showdown. So we've tested the 120s and the 80mm cooler, and we've tested the D15S, H5 Universal and Dark Rock 4 in our 160mm cooler category so far. All we've got left to test and review is the Scythe Mugen 5 and the Thermaltake Macho Rev.B. So if you want to check out any of those other coolers, you can check it out in the top right hand corner. So if you want to skip to any particular part of this video, you can go to the video description or the first comment, which is pinned, which has all of the timestamps for the video. So if you want to skip ahead to the installation or the thermal testing or sound testing, which is more perceptive than anything, no decibel figures there, I haven't exactly got the room for it, but anyway, so if you want to skip to any of those, please go to the video description and click on those timestamps. If you want to purchase this cooler or check out the price in your local region, you can head to the video description and check out the Amazon affiliate links. If you do purchase anything through those affiliate links, then the channel does get a small kickback, depending on the region, between 4 and 12%. So, thank you very much for checking this out so far. I hope you enjoy the video. I hope you get everything you can from it, and if you don't, then let me know in the video description, in the comments section, and I'll do my best to help out. So, I'll catch you in a second to kick off with the unboxing. The Scythe Mugen 5 is up against some pretty stiff competition in the 160mm cooler category. It's the underdog here, measuring in at only 155mm tall. Now, I don't generally cover box specs since it's a surefire way to make a boring video, but I've never seen box specs covered in multiple languages like this before. Anyway, I'll be covering relevant specs throughout the video, so you can head back to here if you want to read them yourself. As for what's inside the box, it's the pretty ubiquitous accessories box, fan, and of course the cooler. Covering the accessories box contents first, there's not actually a lot here, but that doesn't mean it's lacking. If you check the socket compatibility listed on the screen now, it covers the most relevant Intel and AMD sockets, including AM4. A quick rundown of the contents in a clockwise fashion. Up to the top left, we have 2 packs of mounting hardware, the Intel backplate, AMD users require their stock backplates, an installation guide, 2 sets of fan clips, some thermal paste, AMD's and Intel's mounting arms, and a long thin screwdriver just out of view. Sorry guys, I tried. Just a quick look at the installation guide. I really like to be quiet for its thoroughness, but this one's got an almost comic book style layout after you get past the scope of delivery section. The instructions are mainly illustrations with minimal text and the odd magnified detail to clarify each step. But that's enough from the manual, let's move on to the cooler. This is the Scythe Mugen 5. Oh no, that's a screwdriver. Okay, now this is the Scythe Mugen... Oh fuck. Okay, right. This is the Scythe Mugen 5. I knew I could do it. The Scythe Mugen 5 isn't much of a looker from this kind of angle, but it's got it where it counts. Up top are some of the largest and most impressive heat pipe caps I've seen on a cooler. They give it a larger presence than a crushed heat pipe would, and the thicker aluminium top plate really helps round the look off. Though something I'm not a huge fan of is the Scythe logo. To me it looks a little too complex and fiddly, which in my eyes detracts from the great finish of the heat pipe caps, but that's just personal preference and has nothing to do with pretty much anything. Both the rear and front of the fin stacks have a variable fin profile, which I assume is to lower the pressure to the center of the stack and encourage a more centered airflow, especially considering there aren't any folded fin edges. Although I'm yet to see any evidence of this working, and this could just be to make it look good. As for RAM compatibility, the rear of the cooler maintains up to 55mm of clearance, only relevant for those who want to install the cooler backwards or have some sort of 8 RAM slot motherboard. And the front of the cooler reveals the fin stack has been offset so that the fan can be attached with full clearance of the RAM slots. A tilt shot from the front and side profile better presents how the heat pipes are formed to accommodate this offset. The lower section of the side profile does a great job of showing the overlaps between the heat pipes as they are changed from a parallel staggered vertical orientation into a parallel horizontal orientation as they run through the base plate. Speaking of which, the base plate is formed, as most are, from 2 separate pieces, a top aluminium section to support a bridge mounting bracket, and the higher thermally conductive nickel-plated copper base plate that increases the heat transfer rate between the CPU IHS and the 6 copper heat pipes. As with most base plates, this one is flat, smooth, and moderately reflective. The flatter and smoother the base plate is, the less thermal paste will need to create a thorough contact to the IHS, the thermal paste being the weak link in the thermal conductivity equation. Since the protective sticker was partially peeled off, we'll need to give the base plate a clean before we move on. This isn't a bad idea for all coolers before installation, since there could be a little residue from the light adhesive that could lower the thermal transfer efficiency of the system. And just before we move on to the installation, we need to talk about the fan. Something you may have noticed when you were watching the last few CPU cooler reviews is that we're looking at a 120mm fan here, as opposed to the previous cooler's 140mm fans. In terms of the outward appearance of the fan, it's got a really nice black and grey colour scheme, and is nicely finished at the corners with these beefy rubber covers. It's these covers that actually mark the fan up as a 27mm fan, when in reality it's a standard 25mm thick fan. I'm also impressed with the finish of the cable, which has a fairly firm plastic sleeve, which all leads to a 4-pin connector for PWM control. As for the performance of the fan, there's not a lot to see from the sticker, but let's break down some stats and compare them to other similarly sized coolers we've recently reviewed. You might want to skip ahead of this if you're not into comparing stats. So here's the stats for the Mugen 5. It spins from 300 to 1200 RPM, check the noise test segment for more on that. It shifts air at a rate of 87 meters cubed per hour, and its air pressure or static pressure is rated at 1.05 millimeters H2O, and that's the last time I'm saying unit types. So let's bring in the other coolers that we're comparing to, the Dark Rock 4, H5 Universal and D15S. These are all 160mm coolers which have on the whole 140mm fans. To my surprise, even the 13mm thick XT140 on the H5 Universal knocks the socks off the Mugen 5's fan, which on a side note is actually called the K's Flex 120 PWM fan. Anyway, it's beaten in max airflow and static pressure capability, and is also a hair faster. With a touch more speed, the version of the A15 fan on the D15S boosts the static pressure capability up to 1.51, and the version of the Silent Wings 3 fan on the Dark Rock 4 sacrifices airflow for static pressure performance while operating at a lower RPM. It's actually here that you can understand the efficiency of the blade designs. So just before we move on, taking a look at the Mugen 5's performance in comparison shows us that its slower 120mm fan isn't providing the performance in comparison to some similarly sized competition. And no, it's actually the loudest cooler here, and it costs just about as much as the H5 Universal. Anyway, that's enough looking at numbers, let's check out how this thing installs. For installation to an LJ1151 socket, we require the Intel backplate, some thumb screws with built-in washers, the Intel mounting arms, some screws, the included screwdriver, yes we actually do need this or something very similar, and of course the cooler itself. So first step is the backplate, which needs aligning with the mounting holes in the motherboard. Of course you'll want to make sure the large holes to the center go over the screws of the socket itself, and the rubber pads are on the side of the motherboard. And then over to the other side of the motherboard, we can fix the backplate in place with the included thumb screws seen earlier, the ones with the built-in washers. These can also be tightened up with the included screwdriver. Next, the two bracket arms can be fixed atop the previously installed thumb screws. These need to be secured with the other set of screws seen earlier. Note that you can fix these arms horizontally to change the orientation of the cooler. This has now created a solid base to mount the cooler to, and for coolers heading towards the 160mm height and upwards, this is the style of bracket that you want. Now for some thermal paste. We're not using the included thermal paste since it adds another variable which would make the thermal testing later less fair, as in fair test. So we're using our control thermal paste, which is Arctic MX2. Not the best on the market, but very average, which should yield some sensible results. We're also using way more than any sane person would in their own build, since we don't know how the mounting solution will function, and I want to make sure there's enough to completely cover the IHS after the installation. And if you weren't already aware, too much makes a negligible performance impact compared to the optimal amount. We'll be checking out how this all spread out just before we check out thermal testing results later. Installing the cooler itself is now a case of offering the screws of the base plate to the arms of the mount created a second ago. And since one of the screws is at the end of a central channel in the cooler, the long thin screwdriver seen earlier is required. So it's just a case of securing the cooler down by going at the screws little by little, and then we can move on to the fan. Now I felt like I was actually making a royal mess of this at the time when I was installing it, but I was trying to stay out of the way of the lighting and the camera, and I've used that excuse before and I'm sorry, I should be better. But I didn't know I was making it look this bad. So if you're not doing it like, well, me, then you should find it's a simple process. This is actually designed very well. If you look towards the top of the cooler, you'll see that there's a small rest that's intended for the rubber pads to sit on, and right beside that is an edge that guides and holds the fan in the correct position. This is both at the top and bottom of the cooler. It's this edge combined with the super easy to use fan clips that makes installing this fan correctly, even at an awful angle, very simple. It's at this point that the fan can be hooked up to the CPU fan header for some PWM control, which will help us with the noise testing in just a second. Then we can add the RAM and switch the system on. If you want to listen to how the fan sounds, stick around for a couple of minutes, or you can skip ahead for some B-roll or some thermal testing results. So as for the perceptive sound test, nothing like decibel figures or anything like that. We are purely listening to the sound of my voice, the sound of a click of a mouse as a reference sound, and the sound of the fan itself. Now this fan claims to go from 300 to 1200 RPM, which is not too bad. It's not very fast for a fan, but here's the catch. The 300 lower figure is plus or minus 200. That's not 200%, that's just 200 RPM. So it's kind of saying that it could go as low as 100 RPM, which would be amazing, because I mean that would be fantastic for most people. You know, having it going down to 100 RPM would be brilliant. I mean, most fans, even the Noctua fans, things like that, could only manage going down to 300 or, you know, 270 in my testing. So the problem I'm having with this is that I can't get mine to go any lower than 650 RPM, where every other fan I've tested has always been plugged into the CPU fan header. I've always stuck the PWM range all the way down to 20%, and it's always hit the lower figure that's stated on the package. But this one, it's so basically if we say it could be plus 200 from the 300 minimum, we're looking at 500 RPM. I suppose if you say plus or minus 10% on top of that, then 550, but I can't get it to go any lower than 650. So though that's what we're going to have to deal with. So this is what the lowest limit of at least this fan or this, I know, product off the line that should be plus or minus 200 RPM from the 300 sounds like. So 650 RPM. So there we go. I'm not sure I mentioned it. I got terrible short-term memory. Half the time I do clip takes, I can't remember what I said at the start. So that was the reference click, just to make, you know, give some sort of comparative sound. So it's noticeable, but of course it's not very irritating, it's not very loud, it's pretty quiet for a 600 RPM spinning fan. So we'll kick it up to 60% on the PWM fan curve, that's between 20 and 100, of course. So we'll click it up to 60% on the PWM fan curve and see what it spins at and what that sounds like. So 60% on the PWM fan curve, we're looking at 1000 RPM, so we are more than halfway to the 100%, which should be around 1200 plus or minus 10%. I'm assuming due to the higher starting range, starting speed, we'll be looking at the higher range of speed, so perhaps more towards 1320, something like that on the RPM. So this is 1000 RPM, and this is what that sounds like. So yeah, I'm not sure I know, I didn't mention that the microphone is 60 centimeters away and it's set at the same setting for every test. Not that we can take this, line them all together, there's slight audio editing here and there depending on how the video turns out, but I suppose with the click you could line it up and make it work, but we're not doing that. So that's what that sounds like. We'll kick it up to 100%, see what it spins at, and then what that sounds like. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit strange. So, we're at 100% on the PWM fan range, or fan curve, however you'd like to say that, and it's only just hitting 1200 RPM. So we started off at 20% on the fan curve at 650 RPM, then we went up to 60% and we were at the 1000 RPM range, and now we're at the 100% and it's giving us 1200. So there's clearly some sort of curve going on, some sort of imbalance, sort of negatively logarithmic or exponential curve going on. So that's a little strange. And I suspect that if we had a fan that went down to say the more towards the 300 RPM where it should be sitting at, we would see perhaps a more even spread, or maybe an even worse spread. I mean, I don't really know, I can't test this, I've only got this fan unit. So this is at 1200 RPM, this is what that sounds like. So with all my negative criticism of how the fan is running, it's actually pretty quiet. I really can't complain too much here. Having this running at 100% while you're doing pretty much anything inside a case is probably going to be a quiet hum. It's not a high-pitched one, so it's not one that's going to get on your nerves. Not a lot of motor noise at all. In fact, I can't really hear any motor noise. It's just air being passed through the fins. So no complaints here. If you had a sound dampened case as well, then you would probably barely be able to hear it. Something like the Define Mini C Tempered Glass Edition, something like that. So, without further ado, let's first check out a little bit of B-roll footage. I'm going to try and keep it like to a minute this time because there's not that many angles you can look at that we haven't looked at already. Then we'll go into the thermal paste application, and then we'll check out some thermal testing results. It's certainly a looker, but I'm still not a fan of that logo. Anyway, how did the thermal paste spread? Well, let's check it out. Reversing the installation procedure was as simple as, well, installing it in the first place. Something I always make sure I do is have something soft underneath the cooler, just in case it slips and scrapes onto the aluminium backplate of the graphics card. I recommend you do the same in your cases, and no, static charge isn't really a problem here. As you can see, the thermal paste was pretty thorough, with plenty of excess paste around the edges of the cooler's base plate, but looking to the lower left there's a pretty bare corner, and to the right is where the excess resides. And the IHS of the CPU also has plenty of excess, but a nice thin spread out to the center, thin enough to read the text on the IHS. However, this also confirms what we found on the heatsink base plate. There appears to be a touch of the paste not covering the lower right corner. Perhaps the asymmetrical design of the cooler encouraged this kind of spread. So let's see how the thermal testing results turned out. A quick breakdown of how these graphs work is as follows, but feel free to skip ahead if you've seen these graphs in previous videos. The grey bars represent frames per second, which in these cooler results don't really move much away further from tolerance, so it's not really worth paying much attention to them, but I like to track both a visual and thermal metric to cover performance thoroughly. Speaking of the thermal metric, the blue bars represent CPU temperature in degrees Celsius, which is also represented in a delta T format, which means the ambient temperature of the room has been subtracted from the temperature of the component. This makes comparing results more straightforward. The purple bar tracks each cooler's height, and you'll notice that the graph is ordered by height, with the shortest cooler at the top and the tallest at the bottom. It's worth noting that we have tested smaller coolers, but to make the graph less of a headache to look at, they're not included in this one. I've also added an additional level of sorting to the graph, which sorts by CPU thermal performance after cooler height. This means the graphs will move around a little here and there, but I'll highlight all the talking points as we go. And lastly, at least for the graphs, I've included a blue dotted line, which is the CPU temperature trend line. This helps to make snap judgments of cooler's performance relative to the performance of the group. And just a final couple of points, all fans on the test bench, so that's the CPU coolers fan and the graphics card fans, are running at full speed throughout the tests. This prevents fan curves from introducing exponential variables that make straightforward performance comparisons more difficult. And very finally, I'll be skipping past some tests to not draw this out too long, but you can pause the video to analyse them yourselves. So we're skipping straight past the Firestrike results and over to Unigine Heaven. Unigine Heaven shows us that the Mugen 5 is pulling some punches at the taller Dark Rock 4. They're overlapping tolerance bars, but the Mugen 5 is edging ahead here. But bear in mind that this is a low CPU usage test, so it's not all over. Unigine Superposition sees the Mugen 5 and Dark Rock 4 neck and neck, but the Mugen 5 is just barely out of range of tolerance of the D15S. Don't anticipate too much from the H5 Universal and Hyper 212 Evo here, they won't be making any comebacks. More of the same is to be found with Dirt 3, which is starting off our gaming benchmarks. The Mugen 5 and Dark Rock 4 are fighting for second place. But Dirt Showdown sees a rerun of the Heaven result as the Mugen 5 starts edging ahead of the Dark Rock 4 again, but it's not quite yet good enough to take on the D15S. But all of a sudden, it was. I reran the Tomb Raider benchmark 3 times to see if this result was a random off-chance occurrence, but it was repeatable. The Mugen 5 was beating the D15S and the Dark Rock 4 here. Hitman shows the Mugen 5 in second place between the Dark Rock 4 and D15S. It's also worth noting the D9L further up the graph has been a consistently high performer, which is also producing surprisingly good results considering its size. And ending our gaming benchmarks, GTA 5 sends the Mugen 5 behind the D15S and Dark Rock 4 by just over a degree. But now for the serious benchmark, not that we're not taking the previous benchmark seriously, Pro 95 will show us who will be the outright winner of the duel between the Mugen 5 and the Dark Rock 4. And the winner is the Dark Rock 4. With just 0.2 degrees C difference between the two, the Dark Rock 4 barely pulls out ahead. But if we're taking tolerance bars into consideration, it's an outright draw between the two. The Mugen 5 put up a seriously impressive fight though, and I'd wager that if an extra 5mm to the Mugen 5's fin stack was added, it would have taken the victory, but would probably still be within tolerance. But there are a lot of what ifs to be had here. What if a slightly higher spec fan came with the Mugen 5? What if the Mugen 5 cared less about RAM compatibility and increased its fin surface area like the Dark Rock 4 does? Either way, it doesn't really matter. It's an excellent cooler that deserves your consideration. So clearly thermal testing very well there, so I just want to wrap up with a bit of a pros and cons segment, a bit of a conclusion to the video. Starting off with cons, I mean, I'm really struggling and trying to rack my brain for something that I really didn't like about it that is worthy of saying I didn't like it. Unlike in a lot of the other videos of the reviews of the other 160mm coolers, I generally found something that I thought was a little bit off. I mean, okay, I suppose the fan situation with this cooler is a bit odd. It's starting off at 600 when it should start off at more towards 300, plus or minus 200 apparently. So that's a bit of an off thing, but again, that's still not as fast as a starting speed as the H5 Universal. It didn't have any groundbreaking issues or game-changing issues, game-breaking issues, I guess, as the Dark Rock 4 did with its fan clips, and it performed exceptionally well. Taking price into account, price to performance wise, I don't think it's beatable, especially in the 160mm cooler category. So at least the ones I've tested, so if there are any other ones that you suggest I should check out, then please let me know in the video description. This won't change the ones that I'm using for the case testing rig, which it's all competing towards, but I will certainly check other suggestions out as and when I can. As for pros, well, you can pretty much take a look at any part of this cooler and find something good to say about it, or at least stand out positive to say about it in comparison to a lot of coolers. There weren't any glaring issues with the fan apart from that fan speed issue. The fan does look great, it's got a nice colour scheme, it's got some nice mounting rubber pads on the corners so it dampens the vibrations. In terms of the mounting mechanism, solid, very competent, no issues there. It was a little stiff to screw in the sort of base plate mounting screws, but I mean, it being a bit stiff to tighten it up, not really that much of a con. Not so stiff that, you know, a child couldn't do it, or somebody with probably with sort of arthritis or issues like that who can operate a screwdriver normally couldn't cope with this. So nothing game-breaking there. It looks great. I'm not a massive fan of the logo, but I mean, that's a personal preference thing. So, and the fan clips were competent. They weren't anything special fancy. They could have reduced the size of the lip of the hook on there to make it a bit more low profile, but you know, it's not really a problem. If it functions well, then I can't really criticize too far, and aesthetically, that's just up to the individual, so it's really not a con or a pro in that regard, apart from that it functions very well, so in that regard, yes, it is a pro. So that's pretty much it. There's not really much more to say about it. Would I recommend the cooler over the other coolers? Absolutely, I certainly would. You can't damage it like you can with the Dark Rock 4 very easily. It's very well constructed. It has great thermals. For the price, it's fantastic. It's a touch smaller than the other coolers, so and taking thermals into account, that's a great thing because it means it's more compatible with more cases. And I mean, it has full RAM compatibility and 55mm clearance at the back. I don't think you can go wrong with this cooler. So if you were considering this cooler and you were a bit on the edge, should I buy it over something like an H5 Universal or a D15S, then if all you've got to spend is around £40 or your regional equivalent, then yes, you should buy it. So thanks so much for checking this one out. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like it, and if you didn't, please dislike it, and let me know in the comments if you did or didn't like it, and let me know. That's not as smooth as other people's outros are, but anyway, if you did or didn't like it, let me know in the comments, and I can change things for the better for future reviews. If you want to support the channel any further, then you can check out the Patreon, and you can donate whatever you fancy to that, and I'd be extremely grateful for that, which means we can check out more interesting coolers, more interesting bits of tech, and cover them in more interesting ways. If you want to check out the prices for this cooler in your region or purchase the cooler on Amazon, check out the Amazon affiliate links in the video description, and if you do purchase anything through those, then there is a small kickback to the channel as mentioned earlier, between 4 and 12% depending on the region. Thanks for checking this one out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one, which will be the Thermaltake Macho Rev.B.